All right, my name is Nikki Aktipis, and for my case study, I chose to work on the LGBTQ or queer case study that involved gender identity and what a school was or wasn't going to do to support a queer youth. So before we get started, I just wanted to give us a little roadmap about where we're going. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the context of this particular case, the who, what, where, and when of it. Then we're going to move on to any background laws, such as any laws in place around the timeline of when this particular case might have happened, and any ethical guidelines or ethical decision making that should and might be considered. And then finally, we're going to talk about what conclusions can be drawn here and what action should be taken and the rationale behind them. So again, like I said, I chose the case student transgressions. We have quite a list of participants here, and I'm just going to go through them. Please excuse me if I butcher some of these names, but doing my best this afternoon. So one of the main characters in this case is Miss Regis, who is the counselor for the school that they are all at. They are all at Redline Middle School, which is somewhere in the southern United States. And then we have Mr. Guler, who is a veteran science teacher. We have Miss Carter, who is the student's mother. Miss Thomas, who's the student's math teacher. We have Keith, or K. Brianna, who is the student in question here. We have Miss Dean, who is a newer teacher to the district. She is a social studies teacher. And Miss Jackson, the English teacher. So as I stated earlier, we are talking about a middle school somewhere in the southern United States. It seems like it's a pretty conservative town. Most teachers that are at this school are from the local community, so they probably match that conservative demographic. And the when of the incident wasn't really pointed out directly in the article, but from the context that I got, I would have to say it was somewhere between the years 2016 to 2020 during the former presidential administration's time in office. So it seems like that's kind of the timeline, somewhere within that 4 years of which this particular case may have happened. So just to give everybody a little bit more details about this particular case. So Miss Regis is kind of the one facilitating the meeting that is happening between all of these teachers. And it seems like at the end of the day, she's probably going to be the one to have to make a call on which route they decide to go down with the students and the parents and all of that. So I tried to split the individuals up in this case by their beliefs or how they were presenting during the conversation they were having. So over in the purple side, we have the individuals who are more or less supportive of the student and the student themselves. We have in the red circle solely, we have the individuals who are very adamant about gender norms and supporting strictly the parents' wishes and all of that. And then in the middle, we have some kind of mix in between. So going back to the purple side, we have Miss Dean, who I said is a new teacher. She is part of the TFA program or the Teach for America program. She's from more of a liberal background. I believe the article said she was originally from New York City. And during the conversation, as this case unfolded, as the story unfolded, she was very supportive of the student and seemed like she really wanted to start more inclusive programming at Redline and was positively advocating for the student, saying, well, somebody has to support this student. Why shouldn't it be us? You know, we should try. And then we have the student also over in purple, because I would say the student's going to advocate for themselves, or they should. Keith, or K. Brianna, who has been really expressing themselves at school. They're a middle schooler. Middle schoolers are weird and beautiful anyways. And it seems like they have just are trying to represent themselves or just figure out some stuff. And they've come into school with a blonde wig and pink fingernail polish. And they've chosen a name for themselves. So their birth name is Keith. Their chosen name is K. Brianna. And so they probably have put some thought into this. It's probably not a new thing for them, but it's probably a new thing that they're expressing out loud. So over in the red circle, we have Miss Jackson, who throughout reading the case, was very hardlined about gender norms, keeping those traditional gender norms, and was very adamant that they should support Miss Carter's parenting choices, regardless of maybe what harm it does to the student. And then we have Miss Guler, who thinks there's too much time being spent on this particular student. They think the student is just acting out. They saw behavior last year of this student doing certain activities, and she just thinks that the student is attention seeking. And just brings up previous instances and kind of is dismissive of some of the newer staff members. Then in the center, we have Miss Carter, which is the student's parent, the student's mother. There's not much interaction with her in this story except for some secondhand knowledge, but it really doesn't seem like Miss Carter is super accepting. But I was making this assumption she probably wants best for her child. It was stated that she was very pleased when school called her and said, hey, your child is come to school with blonde wig, come get them. They're being upsetting to everybody else. They've got pink fingernail polish on. They're causing a ruckus just by existing with their pink nail polish on. And she was said to have said that she was glad the school did discipline her child and sent them home. And then finally, we have Miss Thomas, who isn't super of the student, but also feels like the student isn't fitting culturally at the school, and really is pushing for recommending for the student to transfer to somewhere that might be more accepting. And it sounds like it's within the district. So is really pushing for Ms. Regis to give this option to mom. So before we get to my analysis on this case in particular, I want to go over some background laws and maybe just some ethical questions that might be lingering, or at least lingered in my brain. And before I do that, I will preface this with saying I looked solely at trans or anti-trans legislation, because it seems like the student to me falls into that category due to their gender expression. I didn't focus on the rest of the queer community, such as if this child is gay or straight or bisexual or whatever, because that wasn't really part of the story that was being told. It was more, the story was surrounding outward gender expression. So as I was looking at laws and legislation about trans or anti-trans legislation, I narrowed it down to what I thought when I thought the case could have theoretically happened. So all of this information is based on between the years 2015 and 2020, right before the previous administration ended. So one of the big things that was stated in the case, I believe, by one of the teachers was that there was a big media hubbub going on at the time around trans issues. And so that's what led me to believe that this was probably a case based in during the previous presidential administration, because the previous administration was really adamant on pushing back on trans rights, such as in 2017, the Trump administration rescinded Obama-era fair restroom usage protections, which meant that the traditional bathrooms of male and female were backed up. So a lot of organizations and nonprofits really push for gender neutral bathrooms to be more inclusive, not only to trans individuals, but also intersex individuals and what have you. And these protections were rescinded by the Trump administration, to where certain states could go then and say, well, we are saying that your biological sex determines what bathroom you go into. And we'll talk about why that may or may not be dangerous here in a second. And then while also looking at background laws here, there were an awful lot of anti-trans restroom legislations pushed through or were attempted in a lot of states. I did not list them all here because, believe it or not, it was quite a few. So I really just highlighted the more notable ones. So I've got down here Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Wisconsin, just to name a few. I believe Tennessee and Virginia, and if I remember correctly, maybe even Wisconsin, did get their bills passed. Generally speaking, they were saying bathrooms are by assigned biological sex only within their communities. And a lot of these bills got going because of the Trump administration rescinding these protections, saying, well, let's leave it up to the states. It's not the federal government to get involved. I know that Texas's did not pass. I believe they're trying again, which different presentation for a different day. And I'm not sure if I remember correctly if North Carolina passed theirs or not. But again, like I said, these are just a few that within those years between 2000 and 2015, 2020, that tried to pass anti-trans legislation. And then besides just the bathroom legislations, there have been multiple bills in multiple states banning or attempting to ban or restrict trans athletes, especially at the school age level, so high school level for the most part. There were multiple states. I did not list them here. And they're anti-trans. So for the most part, to summarize, these bans or restrictions on trans athletes is more or less you play the sport that is your biological sex, not how you identify or are transitioned to whatever. And then along with that, the trans athletes anti-trans bathroom bills. Another big one is bans or restrictions on trans healthcare. Again, this is in a lot of states. There have been multiple bills restricting trans healthcare, which could mean either insurance is paying for therapy sessions, or paying for top or bottom surgery, or paying for hormone replacement therapy. And there are a lot of bills that were saying, well, we're not going to require employers to carry insurance that will give you these healthcare options. So this kind of fits into the narrative of where teachers, it's a relatively conservative area. They're not quite sure what's happening in the realm of trans individuals, and they're not, a lot of them seeming to want to support trans individuals, especially trans youth. So from an ethical standpoint, I personally had several questions when I was researching this and thinking about this case. So I understand completely that this is in the southern part of the country, but my question here was, because I did not see this in the case study, and I could be incorrect that it wasn't there, but is Redline Middle School a public school? Because if so, there are all kinds of laws that govern how you can treat students and what the confidentiality is between students and counselors and teachers, and treating students with equality and equity, even if it doesn't quote unquote align with community standards and all of that. Because if this is a public school, there's a lot more variables, or there are a lot more different variables than there would be if this was a private or a charter school. Because I understand charter schools, private schools can pick and choose their students a little bit more freely than public schools. The student, if this is a public school, has the right to be there regardless if there's school choice open or not. And so my next ethical question was, what is the ethical obligation of a teacher in general or a counselor? So going through the story and having Miss Regis as kind of like the mediator for all of this, I thought about what it means to be a counselor, especially a counselor for those in our schools, as a school counselor to young people. And I would have to say overall, Miss Regis does have the responsibility to think of all of the options and to suggest all of the options and all of the resources instead of one particular choice. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And then I thought about what is the ethical obligation of a teacher. So as a teacher, going into my second year, I thought about what my ethical obligation would be to a student that I might not get along with, or I might not agree with their thought process or whatever. And I came down to, it is my ethical obligation, regardless, and I think this is for all teachers, in my opinion, is to protect that child, regardless of your own personal beliefs. School is a safe space for a lot of kids, especially in my school district. So thinking about that. So to not show support to that child, regardless of what my personal beliefs are, it's not great. You should be supporting that child and mentoring them regardless, and keeping them safe and thinking about their autonomy and what they want. or what they need. And then, so my next question was, has there been any consideration for the overall health of the student body? So there was some talk in the case study about how the student questions, their behavior was being perceived as disruptive and out of line, and it was distracting to other students. But let's think about it. It's middle school. Middle schoolers are, for all intents and purposes, like goldfish. They're like, oh, something new and different. This is distracting. So, which is not a problem. We've all been there, right? We've all been children before, even though it might be hard to remember that sometimes that we were distracted by literally anything and everything. But if you act like it's a normal thing, the children, the students are going to learn to accept it, right? And they're going to question it. Because let's be honest, Keith or Kay Brianna is not the only student at that school that probably is trans. And by seeing somebody who's openly trans in the school or was expressing their gender identity differently, it's going to be healthier for the students overall. It's going to show that, hey, I have these feelings too, or I have feelings that are different but are similar, but I feel like I can be who I need to be at school because school is my safe space, even if I can't be that at home. And then finally, my last question here is, has anybody actually done research on the science behind transhood and trans individuals? As a scientist, I know this is close to my heart, that I always want more information before making any decision on just about anything in my life. But as an educational community at whole, we talk about, being able to do educational research. We've been able to, talk about changing best practices to help our students and make sure our students are safe. So maybe somebody within that school or school district needs to do some research, regardless of the laws that are over here, and get a better understanding on that, even if it doesn't fit into their own personal beliefs. So here I have 4 points to my analysis. What shouldn't have happened during this case study. So number one is facilitation. So has anybody actually decided that they need to sit down specifically with the student when they're not, quote unquote, getting in trouble and having a conversation with this individual about why they're doing the things they're doing? And yeah, just how did they come to this conclusion besides, oh yeah, it's just a joke. I was just trying to stir things up. Because it sounds like every time somebody's talked to the student, it was more an authoritarian kind of conversation where it was like reprimanding instead of being like, hey, like I want to talk about what you're up to right now. And so I say this because research suggests that young kids, even younger than middle school, often have a grip on their identity and developing sexual orientation in elementary school. So going back to the example of, I think it was Miss Guler bringing up the fact that this particular student has acted out before, doing other certain things and trying to get attention. Maybe it's just time to have a conversation with that student and be like, hey, like, it seems like the last couple of years you've been struggling. Like, is there something weird going on at home? Like, what's happening in your head? Like, you can talk to us and be supportive without being judgmental, right? Second, here in my analysis, I really thought about mediation. So this might be a weird word to put for this, But I thought about, has anybody done mediation between the student and their parents? Um, Even though mom and dad, if dad's around, we know at least mom is around. Maybe there's another mom who knows the parent dynamic there, which we know of one parent, right? Has anybody recommended some family counseling and being like, hey, like, I know you don't like your kid running around in a blonde wig, but maybe you should sit down and talk to him. And I understand parents will get defensive and be like, don't tell me how to parent, whatever. But showing that with the student being like, hey, we're going to talk in my office, I'm a school counselor, whatever, shows the student, hey, I'm supporting you. And it's also saying, hey, parents, I recognize you and I'm supporting you as well. I will, help you mediate this situation and maybe we can figure out some things together, right? So 3, I have challenging personal beliefs. And my question here was, what harm would come from challenging one's beliefs surrounding trans rights? So research really shows that having just one person in a queer child's life who is supportive of who they are reduces the risk of self-harm and suicide within the queer community, especially amongst queer youth. So thinking about it this way, what harm would come to these teachers or the counselor themselves if they sat down and did some scientific research about trans rights and trans individuals? They might not change their minds, but they might end up saving somebody else's life. They might end up saving one of their students' lives by saying, okay, well, like, still not sure about this, but I understand what's happening here. And, learn to be a little bit more supportive, regardless of what you're feeling personally, right? And then finally, my 4th point I wanted to make was acceptance. So I split this into 2 questions, 2 sides of the same coin. So what harm could come of being accepting of this particular student? What harm could come from non-acceptance? So I mentioned previously that queer youth, if they have one person, at least one person in their life that is supportive and sees them for who they are at a reduced risk of self-mutilation, self-harm, or suicide. So there's that. Harm that could still come from non-acceptance is this child continues to be bullied. Other children continue to be bullied. They, don't get the resources that they need, such as counseling for transitioning or whatever. And it keeps other students in the closet, whether they want to be or not. So, in my opinion, it is more harmful to have non-acceptance than to accept and have to deal with the consequences of the community being like, well, that's not what we want. And my final thoughts here are, so I believe this school should work with the student and their parents to figure out what's going on, to maybe push forth some sort of equality or equity training within the school, and maybe build to the school district. I think the student should stay at this school because asking them to move to another school or choose another school would, one, it's not guaranteeing that they'll be accepted there. 2, they're going to lose whatever friends they have at their current school, probably. They're going to feel isolated. And 3, the student is going to feel unwanted, right? Because kids aren't dumb. Should never treat a child like they're dumb. But they're gonna know why they had to move schools, right? Even if mom doesn't tell them the truth. So overall, I believe that Miss Regis should sit down, outline the choices with the parent, but also be supportive and be like, hey, like, we really want your kid here. What can we do to assist that? While also respecting the student, being like, hey, you know, what can we do to support you here? What can we do to make sure that everything's going to be okay? Right? So this particular case was difficult for me to read about and everything, because I'm a big LGBTQ advocate in the Kansas City area. And so it kind of tugs on my heartstrings a little bit when I hear um, stories like this, whether this one is obviously probably fictitious, but stuff like this does happen in real life. Um, so that's why I chose to do this particular one. And it was interesting to see all of the legislation that has been tried to be passed. And as a final side note, um, 2021 has been the worst year for LGBTQ rights in the United States. There have been a ridiculous amount of laws being presented at the state level or federal level, not in favor of trans and other queer people.